Hello, how are you doing? I hope you had a good reading month in November. I think I read more nonfiction in the past month than I've ever read in my entire life. I wanted to participate in Nonfiction November. There were also some book prizes I was following that specialize in nonfiction. There was a buddy read, there was a book club read that both happened to be nonfiction. So all of these converged to mean that I read a lot of nonfiction this past month, which was great, and some really excellent reads. I also got to some fiction. I gave up on one book, did not finish it, but then a couple other reads I absolutely loved. So I'm very excited to talk about these books. I'd love to know about what you've read in the past month, or if you've read any of these books, if you have any thoughts about them, or if you're interested in reading them now, please let me know about that in the comments below. But I think I'm going to start with a novel, a great big whopper of a novel, which took a lot of time, but was so fascinating. Nights of Plague by Orhan Pamuk, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. This is his most recent novel. It's almost 700 pages long, a proper epic, historical epic, set at the beginning of 1900. Really well worth it. So the novel begins on a ship where a few different figures have converged on this ship. There's the royal chemist, the Sultan's chemist. There's also Princess Pakize, who's a niece of the Sultan, and her husband, who is a doctor. And so they travel to this fictional island of Mingaria, and all on different missions, though they also don't really understand why, the secret reasons the Sultan has sent them there. So this is set during the final years of the Ottoman Empire. So it's looking at the gradual disintegration of that empire, but also this instance on this island, which is beset by plague, which obviously creates a very dramatic situation for the characters that land there, especially the chemist and the doctor who are involved in medicine. But there are also a lot of political conflicts going on. There's a lot of subterfuge and mystery, and so there are a lot of plot lines, but he balances it so well to tell this very compelling story, which completely absorbed me, and I loved reading about this. And I was slightly trepidatious about it because it's all about a plague, and we just went through a lot of these things, but it's so interesting how he fictionalizes the experiences and a lot of the conflicts that went on at this time. Obviously, there a lot less was known about medicine and how to prevent the spread of a plague, but at the same time, there were so many conflicts to do with religion and nationality that naturally rose up to the surface during this time of crisis and economic hardship, and so a lot of factors were all going on at the same time. But it's so fascinating to see what happened to a number of these characters. There's a lot of dramatic instances. There's a lot of good humor in this as well, because the Sultan is a fan of Sherlock Holmes mysteries. So when some crimes occur, he wants them to use the Sherlock Holmes method of deducing who the culprits were, which is just kind of comical way of looking at it. It's framed also under this device where an author more in the present time is writing this fictional account, but drawing upon some letters written by Princess Pakize and other nonfiction factual information to create this history of this island during this time of dramatic change, and how she presents that and how this frame works over the course of the book is so interesting as well. At first, I wasn't sure. I thought maybe it was slightly too complicated way of presenting the story, but how it comes into it, and that then the author comes into it, the author of this fictional account, who's a female writer, how she comes into the story itself towards the end is really poignant and meaningful. And so yeah, I enjoyed this story so much, and yeah, I thought it was well worth the time. And this was the first time I read Orhan Pamuk, so I'm really keen to read more of his fiction. If you've read other of his books that you would recommend, please let me know about that. I read this really fascinating travelogue / meditation on nationality and life and identity, A Line in the World by Dorthe Nors, who's a Danish writer. I've read a novel of hers in the past, which I thought was really interesting, though I didn't wholly love it. And I kind of felt the same way about this book. It was really fascinating. I'm glad to have read it, but yeah, I didn't completely love it. So it's her account of traveling up an area of the coastline, which you can see here on a map in Europe, where she was raised, and she's sort of from this land, but she writes about how she moved back to this coastline and feels like an outsider, even though she was born and raised here, and how she explores different areas of this coastline to do with the history and the environmental impact of a number of industries there, and the functions of communities along these different areas of coastline. And in doing so, sort of meditating on where we fit in our life. She continuously talks about a schism in our experience of how there's this sort of intersection between memory and history and our place in the world, and how we kind of fall between the crack, and that's where identity is formed. And she continuously comes back to this in an interesting way. There's some absolutely beautiful passages in this, and I like how she overlays this survey of the landscape with also the fictional ideas of the past. At one point, she talks about this area of the sea that's sort of known as the Bermuda Triangle of the North, in that mysterious things were said to have occurred here, but this is all just sort of fantasy and made up. And so yeah, I like this kind of like blending of history and fact, with this kind of mythology and the fiction that communities create around their areas. And but I also have to say, this is such a beautiful book. I mean, as a physical object, I mean, look at how gorgeous it is. A Very Short History of Life on Earth by Henry G. And it's subtitled 4.6 billion years in 12 chapters. And that's exactly what it does. It gives this very concise history of life on Earth, from like the dawn of life on our planet and the formation of the planet up until the evolution of humankind, but all the different branches that life spread out in the meantime, and the weird and wonderful creatures that used to populate our planet. And he gives this insight into how there were all these different possibilities of the ways that life could go on this planet, and it seems only sort of coincidence and chance and luck that we are the ones that currently occupy this space on our planet. But it could have gone so many different ways due to environmental factors and issues to do with the way that species sort of evolved over time. And so interesting in that way, completely fascinating and absorbing, and written in a very engaging style that I just loved reading. This also just won the Royal Academy Science Book Prize a couple of nights ago, and I got to go to the ceremony, and it was wonderful to see this author win. And while I was in the building of the Royal Society, as I got my coat and was leaving after the awards ceremony, I saw they had some display cases of scientific artifacts, and in a display case there was Charles Darwin's barometer, and so I had to snap a quick quick picture of that before I left. Also nominated for that award, though it didn't win, is the book Spike, The Virus versus the People by Jeremy Farrar with Anjana Ahuja. And Jeremy Farrar is the head of the Wellcome Trust and a specialist in infectious diseases. And Anjana Ahuja is a journalist specializing in science and who is reporting a lot on the recent pandemic. And both of them were very at the heart of what was occurring in the pandemic in the past couple of years, of reporting and advising on it. And so Jeremy Farrar was advising the UK government and involved in a number of committees to do with that. It's really the inside story of the recent pandemic. And again, I was slightly trepidatious going into this subject matter because the pandemic has sort of swallowed up our lives for the past few years. Did I really want to read more about it? But this was so fascinating, really worth reading, because it gets at the facts of what actually occurred. Even though it was in recent history, there's so much misinformation about what was happening, and it seemed like it was changing every day. And so it tells that dramatic tale and some of their missteps, but also the things that they got right and found out, and what was really happening at the time, versus what was being widely reported by the government in statements. And there's one point where he says that the government was saying they were following the science, but they really weren't. But he also acknowledges that he is just an advisor. He's not actually a politician. So it was just advice. But there were so many instances where the government was blatantly ignoring the best advice that was being given and not taking it into account or believing it. And it's really interesting. Also about the whole the debate about where the disease originated from, and how the author himself, he was terrified for a while, thinking that maybe this was a slip from a scientific facility, but that's been completely disproven, and he sort of shows that, but it very much tells that dramatic story. Such a fascinating book. The Transgender Issue by Shon, Faye, which was such an interesting and helpful book to read, because here in the UK, the transgender issue is such a hot topic that is reported on quite widely, but what the news outlets focus on so much of the time isn't the right story and isn't the right way of approaching this subject matter. So Shon Faye goes to a great degree in much detail, having done a lot of research and thought, and applies a lot of rationale to this subject matter, which has become so hysterical in this country in a really frustrating way, which is ignoring the welfare of the lives of transgender women and men who are suffering and who are often at a big disadvantage and are prone to health risks and homelessness and are at risk of suicide to a much greater degree than the rest of the population. And so how she focuses this argument and says that she didn't want to write a book like this, and because she's a journalist herself, and so is often called upon to write about this issue, being a transgender woman herself, but how she felt she needed to, because there is just so much misunderstanding about this out there, that she sets clear so many of these issues. And I was really grateful to have read this book. It also won a book award in the Books Are My Bag awards, so I got to see her be awarded that, and that was really wonderful evening. I read the memoir Country Girl by Edna O'Brien. I did this as a buddy read with Sarah from Hardcover Hearts, because earlier this year we'd read together the Country Girls trilogy, this fictional trilogy about two girls from a small community in the Irish countryside, and follows them throughout their development, their adult life, as they become wives and mothers. It was such a wonderful reading experience, great novels, although the third book, not so much, but the first two books are really excellent. And so we wanted to read about Edna O'Brien's actual experience and account of her life. And a lot of, I guess unsurprisingly, a lot of instances in her life kind of parallel what she fictionalized, what was happening in the novels, and which in a way that it made reading this slightly more problematic in that it felt like it was just rehashing the same instances that we just read about, although because it was her own experience, it felt more harrowing and personal, obviously, because these things actually happened to her. But it also helped us really understand that third book, which neither of us enjoyed as much as the first two books, and we were slightly confused as to why she chose the style of narrative that she chose to tell that book, which didn't feel as successful as the first two books. But when you learn about her experience and what was happening in her life and the breakdown of her marriage and the strife going on with custody of her children, it makes so much more sense. And so I'm glad to have read this just for that reason. Now, something that slightly detracted from my enjoyment of this book is the sheer amount of name dropping that occurs, particularly in the second half of the book, where Edna O'Brien gives accounts of all of the famous people she has encountered over her lifetime. And it is really impressive in a way. And you sort of read it and you're like, oh, wow. And if you were sort of at a dinner party with her and she was telling this as an anecdote, it would be absolutely fascinating. But the degree to which she goes on and on about it, of her affair with Robert Mitchum and how Paul McCartney sang to her son and Jude Law gave her a kiss once, and how she was close personal friends with Jacqueline Onassis and the many, many other famous people she encounters in her life, it almost felt after a while like she was writing this because of some kind of insecurity, or that she was kind of had to prove herself or associate herself with all these famous people in order to give herself validity. And it's kind of like when I saw this interview with Madonna once, where she was name dropping when she said, oh, when I want to know what's going on in the world, I just message my friend Bill Clinton. And it's like, you're Madonna, you don't need to reference Bill Clinton. I mean, you're famous enough. And I sort of felt the same with Edna O'Brien. It's like I like you. I think you're a really fascinating, interesting, talented author and artist. And so, yeah, I don't know why you have to name drop all of the time. And you do get a little bit of insight. I mean, I think that there's one point where she says she sort of, around the desolation of her marriage, she was very depressed and like on the verge of suicide. And a friend said, oh, but you have to meet this person. And that sort of gave her a reason to continue. So possibly that's the reason why she has this like compulsion to continue to meet all of these celebrities and have encounters with them. But at the same time, yeah, it didn't make it as interesting a reading experience if she was just meditating on her own life and experiences rather than just adding in all of the time about these experiences, or talked about her actual process of writing more, but which she does at some points, but then she'll just revert back to be like, oh, and then I had an encounter with Marlon Brando. And it's like, oh, but it almost seems to trivialize those other bits of the story. So yeah, I had really mixed feelings about it. I thought it was interesting to read, and I'm really glad I read it after reading the Country Girls trilogy. If I had read this before the fiction, I think it would have really detracted from my enjoyment of those novels. But so yeah, we read this the right way around, and it was really interesting discussing it with Sarah. But yeah, I felt quite mixed about it. I also read Zami by Audre Lorde. I don't know, would you call this a novel or a memoir? It's an account which draws on so much of her autobiographical experience, and of course she labels it a biomythography, which is is a really interesting way to term a book. And of course, I made a whole video about how much I loved this. But yeah, as a coming-of-age tale, the way she draws you into the details of her life as she was growing and developing in Harlem, her conflicts with her family, her feelings of being an outsider, of not really fitting in, and then when she finally finds a community that she belongs to later on, when she becomes part of these lesbian circles in her young adulthood, and the many affairs that she has, but then still feels like an outsider because of these groups of largely white women who don't want to believe that they have any racial prejudice and don't want to discuss it, but at the same time there are microaggressions going on around her that she really feels, and how she gives an account of that is so fascinating and meaningful, and I was just completely moved by this story, and there's a beautiful lyricism. Her poetic quality of her prose really comes into the forefront in this, but also the very intellectual way she has of looking at these situations is really profound, and yeah, it's a great book, and I'm so looking forward to reading more by Lorde. Now, I tried to read the novel All About H. Hatterr by G.V. Desani, which is a classic Indian novel from, I think it was first published in the late 40s, and it's sort of known as the Ulysses of India, and so really fascinated to get into it. I tried to read it as a buddy read with Shon, the book maniac, and we both started it. I felt quite disorientated by the frenetic pace of the prose. It follows the story of H. Hatterr and his misadventures as he kind of left school and feels kind of caught between British and Indian culture. He sort of draws upon both of them and makes lots of references to both of these different cultures, and how he's sort of in between, and how he pursues different gurus in a kind of comical way of exploring different issues to do with life. And so it's quite episodic in that way. And that does all sound really promising. But yeah, like I said, the kind of freneticness of the prose, the way it jumps around and leaps between so many different subject matters. And so a lot of the time, I didn't know where I was or what was happening or where the character was, or I felt confused. And there was a lot of innovation to do with the language and playfulness of it, which I appreciated, like on an aesthetic level, but as a sort of story, I just couldn't get into it and got frustrated to it, and there were like plot elements that really confused me. I mean, his mother kind of disappears at one point, and he says, I don't know what happened to her, maybe she lives, who cares? But then there are passages where it's like oh, I feel my life was so disrupted because I lost my mother and I don't know what happens to her. So it's like, well, do you care about her or don't you care about her? It just felt very confusing, sort of character-wise. So it seemed to be a novel much more about the style than the subject matter and the story. I know this author and book was a big influence on Salman Rushdie, and I can really see that, and it's maybe why I haven't always got on with Salman Rushdie's fiction either. But yeah, I really wanted to get into this book and tried really hard with it. I read about 150 pages, more than Shon, but yeah, I just couldn't stick with it. And I also wanted to say I'm currently reading Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, a novel that takes place in Belfast in the mid-80s, following a character who is a Catholic and a teacher, and she works in her family's pub sometimes, and she engages in an affair with a married man who's a Protestant, and how she tells this story and gets into the detail of her characters' lives is so evocative and really gripping, following the effects, especially on the children in her schoolrooms, and the effect that the Troubles are having upon them, the direct effect they're having on their families and their psychological well-being and their education. And so yeah, it's really harrowing, but also meaningful story about this personal tale of love and development and a young woman who's trying to find her way in the world. So yeah, I'm really enjoying it, and I can see why so many people have been talking about this book. So those are all the books I want to talk about that I read over the past month. Like I said, I'd love to know if you've also read any of these, if you agree or disagree with me, or if you're interested in reading them now, or if there are other books you want to tell me about that you read over the past month. I'd really love to hear about them. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.